Case 1. Paul Marshal Curry, a former Jeopardy contestant and nuclear engineer, sat in an Orange County courtroom in September 2014, convicted of using his scientific knowledge to commit what prosecutors called the perfect crime. Paul Marshal Curry had advanced degrees, worked at one of the nation's most secure nuclear facilities, and trained paramedics in emergency medicine. He had competed on national television as a contestant on Jeopardy, where his intellect had been on display for millions of viewers. On June 9, 1994, he used that same intellect to poison his wife with a massive dose of nicotine, collecting more than $400,000 in life insurance. The investigation would take 16 years, but the genius who thought he had gotten away with murder eventually died in prison awaiting the execution of his life sentence. Paul Marshal Curry was born in 1957. By his 30s, he had built a reputation as a brilliant but arrogant man with advanced degrees in science and engineering. He worked as a nuclear engineer at the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station in Southern California, a facility that required the highest security clearances and demanded precision in every task. He also served on the paramedic training staff, teaching emergency medical techniques to first responders. He had appeared on Jeopardy, where his intelligence had been recognized publicly. To those who knew him, Paul was too smart for his own good. What they did not know was that he was also bankrupt. Paul had filed for bankruptcy shortly before he met Linda Curry in 1989. He had hidden ex-wives and children he was supporting financially, and he was drowning in debt. Linda worked as a manager at the San Onofre nuclear plant, where she and Paul had met. She was 50 years old, twice divorced, and close with her sister and friends. In September 1992, Paul married Linda. Her friends warned her that Paul was marrying her for money. Linda loved him anyway. 1 month after the wedding, Paul asked Linda to take out a life insurance policy worth $1 million. She agreed. In 1993, Linda was hospitalized with a mysterious illness. Investigators would later determine that someone had tampered with her IV bag, introducing lidocaine into the line. Linda recovered, but she was shaken. She told police that if anyone ever wanted to hurt her, it would be Paul, and the reason would be money. The warning went nowhere. On June 9, 1994, in San Clemente, California, Linda Curry ingested a massive dose of nicotine combined with Ambien. She was not a smoker. The nicotine was administered secretly, likely injected or mixed into food or drink. The dose was lethal. At 11 p.m., Paul called 911. He told the dispatcher that he had just woken up and found his wife unresponsive in bed. Emergency responders arrived and found Linda lifeless. Paul played the role of the distraught husband. He was calm, controlled, and medically articulate. He had, after all, trained paramedics for years. The autopsy revealed lethal levels of nicotine in Linda's system. She was not a smoker, and there was no plausible explanation for the presence of such a high concentration of the toxin. Investigators also found lidocaine in the hospital IV bag from the 1993 incident. The pattern was clear. Paul had been poisoning Linda for months, and the 1993 hospitalization had been a practice run. Linda's friends suspected Paul immediately. Linda herself had told police in 1993 that Paul was the one person who might hurt her for money. But the case stalled. Prosecutors had no direct evidence that Paul had administered the poison. They had motive, opportunity, and forensic proof that Linda had been poisoned, but they could not prove that Paul had been the one to deliver the fatal dose. The investigation went cold. In 2002, Sergeant Yvonne Scholl and Detective Mike Thompson reopened the case. They reviewed the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and built a circumstantial case based on the timeline of the insurance policy, the 1993 poisoning attempt, and Linda's own statement to police. In November 2010, 16 years after Linda's death, Paul Marshal Curry was arrested in Salina, Kansas. He had relocated there after Linda's death and was working as a building official. He was charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances, including financial gain and murder by poisoning. Prosecutor Ibrahim Baitieh argued that Paul had committed the crime out of pure greed. Paul pleaded not guilty. The death penalty was not sought. The trial began in September 2014 in Orange County Superior Court. Prosecutor Baitieh presented the life insurance policy that Paul had pressured Linda to take out 1 month after their marriage. He presented the evidence of the 1993 lidocaine poisoning, showing that Paul had attempted to kill Linda before and had used his medical knowledge to do it. He presented the autopsy results showing lethal nicotine levels in a woman who did not smoke. He presented Linda's own words to police in 1993, warning them that Paul would hurt her for money. The defense argued that the case was circumstantial and that there was no direct physical evidence proving Paul had administered the poison. The jury was not persuaded. In September 2014, they convicted Paul Marshal Curry of first-degree murder. The sentencing followed the verdict. Paul was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecutor Baitieh addressed the court and the public. Quote, "Zero," Baitieh said. Paul showed no remorse. In 2017, Paul appealed his conviction to the California Court of Appeals. The court upheld the verdict. The case was featured on 48 Hours in an episode titled __, quote, _1, __. It was also covered on the Bloody Murder podcast and Murder with My Husband. Paul Marshal Curry is 69 years old. He is incarcerated in the California state prison system, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He has no possibility of parole. He has served 11 years of his life sentence. Linda Curry was 50 years old when she died. Her friends had warned her. She herself had warned police. A nuclear engineer and paramedic, a man trained to protect human life and to understand the science of safety, used his knowledge to slowly poison the woman he married for money. It took 16 years, but the genius who thought he had committed the perfect crime was eventually caught. The scientific evidence he believed he could outsmart became the evidence that condemned him. Case 2. Matthew Plote. In August of 2020, a volunteer firefighter and EMT in Malta, Illinois, strangled his pregnant girlfriend and set her house on fire to cover up the murder. The woman he killed was Melissa Lamesh, a 27-year-old EMT who was 9 months pregnant with his child and due to give birth within days. Matthew Plote did not want the baby. He did not want the financial responsibility or the social complications of fatherhood. On November 25, 2020, he strangled Melissa in her home in Mount Morris, Illinois, then set the house ablaze to make her death look like smoke inhalation. When the fire department responded to the scene, they found Melissa unresponsive on the kitchen floor. The autopsy revealed the truth. There was no soot in her airways. Melissa Lamesh had been dead before the fire started. Matthew Plote, a man trained to save lives and extinguish fires, had murdered his pregnant girlfriend and let his own unborn child die. Matthew Plote was born in approximately 1988. By November 2020, he was 34 years old and working as a volunteer firefighter and EMT in Malta, Illinois, a small community where first responders were respected and trusted. Plote was generally well regarded in the community. He had no major prior criminal record. He and Melissa Lamesh had been in an on and off romantic relationship for some time. By the fall of 2020, Melissa was 9 months pregnant with Matthew's baby. The child was due within days. Melissa was preparing to become a mother. Matthew was not preparing to become a father. He did not want the child. He did not want the responsibility, the financial burden, or the permanence that fatherhood would bring. The pregnancy represented a future he refused to accept. Melissa Lemesche was 27 years old. She worked as an EMT, the same profession Matthew practiced. She and Matthew had shared the bond of emergency medicine, working in a field that required trust, quick thinking, and a commitment to saving lives. Melissa was 9 months pregnant, her body preparing to give birth to a child who would never draw breath. She was days away from becoming a mother. She was building a life for the baby, preparing the home, gathering the supplies, making the plans. She did not know that the man who had fathered her child had decided that neither she nor the baby would survive. On November 25, 2020, in Mount Morris, Illinois, Matthew Plote strangled Melissa Lemesche in her home. The method was manual strangulation, an intimate and sustained form of violence that requires the killer to maintain pressure until the victim stops breathing. Melissa was 9 months pregnant. The baby inside her was full term and viable. After he killed Melissa, Matthew set the house on fire. The fire was deliberate, designed to destroy evidence and to create a cover story. He wanted investigators to believe that Melissa had died of smoke inhalation in an accidental house fire. The fire department, including Matthew's colleagues from the volunteer fire service, responded to the blaze. They found Melissa unresponsive on the kitchen floor. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial assumption was that she had been overcome by smoke. The assumption was wrong. The autopsy was the breakthrough. The medical examiner found no soot in Melissa's airways. When a person dies of smoke inhalation, soot is present in the nose, mouth, throat, and lungs. The absence of soot meant that Melissa had not been breathing when the fire started. She was already dead. The fire had been staged to cover the murder. Investigators turned their attention to Matthew Plote. He was the last person to see Melissa alive. Digital evidence, including phone records and messages, linked him to the crime. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a stranger entering the home. The evidence pointed to Matthew. In March 2022, 16 months after Melissa's death, Matthew Plote was arrested. He was charged with 10 counts, including first-degree murder, intentional homicide of an unborn child, and concealing a homicidal death. The charges reflected the fact that Matthew had killed 2 people, Melissa and the baby she carried. The trial took place in March 2024 in Ogle County, Illinois. Prosecutors presented the autopsy evidence, showing that Melissa had been dead before the fire started. They presented the digital evidence linking Matthew to the crime. They presented the timeline proving that Matthew was the last person to see Melissa alive. They presented evidence of his motive. He did not want the child, and he did not want the responsibility of fatherhood. The defense offered no compelling alternative explanation. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. On March 2024, they returned a guilty verdict on all 10 counts. Matthew Plote, the volunteer firefighter who had set a fire to cover a murder, had been convicted of killing his pregnant girlfriend and his unborn child. Sentencing followed the verdict. Matthew Plote was sentenced to life in prison. The case was widely covered by Fire Rescue 1, Law and Crime, and regional Illinois media outlets. The coverage highlighted the dangers of domestic violence during pregnancy, a period when women are statistically more vulnerable to violence from intimate partners. Matthew Plote's conviction sent a message that killing a pregnant woman and her unborn child would result in the most severe penalties available under Illinois law. Matthew Plote is 38 years old. He is incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections, where he has served approximately 2 years of his life sentence. Melissa Lemesche was 27 years old and 9 months pregnant. she was days away from giving birth. The man who strangled her and set fire to her home was a volunteer firefighter and EMT, a first responder who had taken an oath to protect life. He killed his own unborn child. The autopsy evidence he tried to destroy with fire became the evidence that convicted him. 2 lives were lost because Matthew Plote refused to accept responsibility for the life he had helped create. The jury needed only 2 hours to deliver justice. Case 3. Peter Cichuniec. In August 2019, a senior paramedic in Aurora, Colorado, legally administered a fatal dose of ketamine to a 23-year-old massage therapist without conducting basic medical checks. Peter Cichuniec was 50 years old and had served as a firefighter and paramedic for 18 years. He was a highly respected professional with no prior criminal record. On August 24, 2019, he arrived at a scene where police had forcefully detained Elijah McClain, a slight 140-pound man who posed no threat to anyone. Cichuniec diagnosed excited delirium from a distance, ordered a massive 500-milligram dose of ketamine, and allowed his subordinate to inject the drug into McClain's shoulder. Cichuniec and his team never took McClain's pulse. They never assessed his weight. They never conducted the most basic patient care protocols. Elijah McClain died from the overdose. In December 2023, Peter Cichuniec became the first paramedic in the United States to be convicted of criminally negligent homicide for actions taken during a police custody incident. Peter Cichuniec was born in approximately 1969. By August 2019, he was 50 years old and working as a senior paramedic with Aurora Fire Rescue in Aurora, Colorado. He had spent 18 years in emergency medicine, rising to a position of authority and trust. He was a firefighter and paramedic, trained to assess patients quickly and to make life-saving decisions under pressure. He had no prior criminal record. His career had been built on the principle that first responders exist to protect and preserve life. On the night of August 24, 2019, he abandoned that principle. Elijah McClain was 23 years old. He worked as a massage therapist in Aurora, Colorado. He was small, weighing only 140 pounds, with a slight build that made him physically non-threatening. On the night he died, he was unarmed. He had been stopped by police, forcefully detained, and restrained. By the time Peter Cichuniec arrived on the scene, Elijah was already subdued. He was not resisting. He was not a danger to the paramedics. He was completely dependent on the first responders present to provide appropriate medical care. That care was never provided. August 24, 2019, Aurora, Colorado. Police had forcefully detained Elijah McClain. The circumstances of the police contact are not the focus of this case, but by the time Peter Cichuniec arrived as the senior paramedic on scene, Elijah was restrained and subdued. Cichuniec assessed the situation from a distance. He did not approach Elijah. He did not take Elijah's pulse. He did not ask Elijah's weight. He diagnosed excited delirium, a controversial and now largely discredited condition, and ordered an immediate injection of ketamine. The dose Cichuniec ordered was 500 milligrams. That dose was calculated for a person weighing more than 200 pounds. Elijah McClain weighed 140 pounds. The dose was 60 pounds too heavy for his body. Cichuniec's subordinate, paramedic Jeremy Cooper, administered the injection. Neither paramedic conducted a basic patient assessment before the drug was delivered. Elijah McClain died from the ketamine overdose. Body cam footage captured the entire incident. Initially, the paramedics were cleared. The case appeared closed. Then, in the summer of 2020, the death of George Floyd and the national protests that followed brought renewed attention to Elijah McClain's case. The public demanded accountability. Body cam footage was reviewed and released publicly. The footage showed paramedics arriving on scene, diagnosing from a distance, and ordering a massive dose of ketamine without taking a pulse or assessing the patient's weight. In 2021, a grand jury was convened. Peter Cichuniec was indicted on charges of criminally negligent homicide and second-degree assault. The indictment was historic. No paramedic in the United States had ever been charged criminally for actions taken during a police custody incident. The trial took place in late 2023 in Adams County, Colorado. Prosecutors argued that Peter Cichuniec had ignored his training and acted with reckless negligence. They presented expert testimony showing that basic patient care requires taking a pulse and assessing weight before administering sedatives. They presented the body cam footage showing that Cichuniec had diagnosed, quote, 4 without examining Elijah, had ordered a dose calculated for a person 60 pounds heavier than the patient, and had allowed the injection to proceed without any assessment. The prosecution emphasized that Cichuniec had 18 years of experience. His negligence was not the mistake of a rookie. It was the abandonment of fundamental protocols by a senior professional. The defense argued that Cichuniec had followed protocols for managing quote, _5, __, and that he had acted in good faith based on the information provided by police. The jury was not persuaded. In December 2023, Peter Cichuniec was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide and second-degree assault. On March 1, 2024, Peter Cichuniec was sentenced to 5 years in prison, the minimum mandatory sentence for the assault charge. The conviction was historic. Peter Cichuniec became the first paramedic in the United States to be sent to prison for actions taken during a police custody incident. The case had immediate and sweeping consequences for emergency medicine. The use of ketamine by paramedics in the field was severely restricted. The diagnosis of quote, _6, was delegitimized by medical organizations nationwide. Training protocols were overhauled to emphasize that basic patient assessment cannot be skipped under any circumstances. Elijah McClain's death forced a national reckoning with how first responders handle individuals in police custody. Peter Cichuniec is 55 years old. He is incarcerated in the Colorado State prison system, where he has served approximately 1 year of his 5-year sentence. He will be eligible for release in approximately 4 years. Elijah McClain was 23 years old, weighed 140 pounds, and was unarmed and restrained when a senior paramedic with 18 years of experience failed to conduct a basic pulse or weight check before ordering a lethal dose of ketamine. The conviction was historic. Elijah's death catalyzed a national transformation in emergency medicine protocols. The most basic patient care standards that were abandoned that night in Aurora are now federal policy. Case 4. Jeremy Cooper. The subordinate paramedic who physically pushed the plunger, injecting a fatal dose of ketamine into Elijah McClain's shoulder, was Jeremy Cooper. He was 48 years old in August 2019 and worked as a paramedic with Aurora Fire Rescue in Colorado. On the night of August 24, 2019, Cooper arrived at a scene where police had detained Elijah McClain, a 23-year-old massage therapist who weighed only 140 pounds. Cooper's supervisor, senior paramedic Peter Cichuniec, ordered a 500 milligram dose of ketamine. Cooper administered the injection. By the time Cooper approached Elijah with the syringe, Elijah was already unconscious. Body cam footage captured the moment. Cooper injected the ketamine into Elijah's shoulder and pushed the plunger. Elijah McClain died from the overdose. When investigators questioned Cooper, he claimed that Elijah had been actively resisting at the time of the injection. Body cam footage proved that Cooper was lying. Elijah had been unconscious. In December 2023, Jeremy Cooper was convicted of criminally negligent homicide. His conviction established a precedent. Subordinate paramedics cannot hide behind the defense of just following orders when basic patient care is abandoned. Jeremy Cooper was born in approximately 1971. By August 2019, he was 48 years old and working as a paramedic with Aurora Fire Rescue. He was a subordinate to Peter Cichuniec, the senior paramedic who made the decision to administer ketamine to Elijah McClain. Cooper was not the decision-maker on the night of August 24, 2019, but he was the one who physically carried out the injection. He was an experienced paramedic, not a rookie. He had professional responsibility to assess the patient and to refuse improper orders if necessary. He did neither. Elijah McClain was 23 years old, the same victim whose death led to the conviction of Peter Cichuniec. Elijah worked as a massage therapist. He weighed 140 pounds and had a slight build. On the night of August 24, 2019, he was unarmed when police detained him. By the time Jeremy Cooper approached him with a syringe full of ketamine, Elijah was restrained and subdued. He was no longer moving. He was unconscious. He posed no threat to anyone. He was entirely vulnerable. August 24, 2019, Aurora, Colorado. Peter Cichuniec, the senior paramedic, ordered a 500 milligram dose of ketamine for Elijah McClain. Jeremy Cooper was assigned to administer the injection. By the time Cooper approached Elijah, Elijah was already unconscious. Body cam footage captured the scene. Elijah was not moving. He was not resisting. He was lying on the ground, subdued by police and unresponsive. Cooper injected the 500 milligrams of ketamine into Elijah's shoulder. He pushed the plunger. The dose was fatal. Elijah McClain died from the ketamine overdose. Later, when investigators questioned Cooper about the incident, he told them that Elijah had been actively resisting at the time of the injection. He claimed that the sedation had been necessary to control a violent and dangerous patient. Body cam footage proved that Cooper's account was false. Elijah had been unconscious. Cooper had lied to investigators. The investigation into Elijah McClain's death was the same investigation that led to Peter Cichuniec's indictment. In the summer of 2020, national protests following the death of George Floyd brought renewed attention to Elijah's case. Body cam footage was reviewed and released publicly. The footage showed that Elijah had been unconscious when Cooper injected him. Cooper's lie to investigators became a key piece of evidence. In 2021, a grand jury indicted both Peter Cichuniec and Jeremy Cooper. Cooper was charged with criminally negligent homicide and second-degree assault. He was tried alongside Cichuniec in a joint trial. The trial took place in December 2023. Prosecutors argued that Jeremy Cooper had physically administered a fatal dose of ketamine and that he had an independent responsibility to assess the patient before injecting. They presented expert testimony showing that basic patient care requires taking a pulse and assessing the patient's condition. Cooper had done neither. They presented the body cam footage showing that Elijah was unconscious at the time of the injection. They presented Cooper's false statement to investigators, in which he had claimed Elijah was resisting. The prosecution argued that just following orders does not eliminate a paramedic's duty of care. The defense argued that Cooper had been following orders from senior paramedic Peter Cichuniec, that Cichuniec had made the decision to administer ketamine, and that Cooper was not responsible for the dose calculation. The defense claimed that Cooper had acted in good faith under the direction of his superior. The jury convicted Jeremy Cooper of criminally negligent homicide, but acquitted him of the second-degree assault charge. The split verdict reflected the jury's recognition that Cooper bore responsibility for the death, but that his role had been subordinate to Cichuniec's. On April 26, 2024, Jeremy Cooper was sentenced. He received a sentence dramatically lighter than Peter Cichuniec's 5-year prison term. Cooper was sentenced to 4 years of probation and 14 months of work release. He would not serve time in traditional prison. The lighter sentence reflected his subordinate role, but the conviction itself was significant. Cooper's conviction established a nationwide precedent. Subordinate medical professionals can be held criminally liable for deaths that result from abandoned patient care, even when they are following orders from a superior. The quote _9. Defense is not absolute. Every paramedic has an independent duty to assess the patient and to refuse orders that violate fundamental protocols. Jeremy Cooper is 53 years old. He is serving probation and work release. He is not incarcerated in a traditional prison. Elijah McClain was 23 years old, weighed 140 pounds, and was unconscious when Jeremy Cooper injected him with a fatal dose of ketamine. Cooper lied about Elijah resisting. Body cam footage exposed the lie. The conviction established that subordinate paramedics cannot hide behind orders from superiors when basic patient care is neglected. Every medical professional has an independent responsibility to take a pulse, to assess a patient, and to refuse orders that violate the duty to do no harm. Case 5. Paul Novak. In December 2008, a New York City EMT enlisted his own ambulance partner to help him murder his wife and burn her house down. Paul Novak was 41 years old and had worked as an EMT at Jamaica Hospital in Queens for nearly 2 decades. He was in the middle of a bitter divorce from his wife, Catherine Novak, and he faced a costly settlement and a custody battle over their 2 children. Paul decided that the solution was to kill Catherine. He recruited Scott Sherwood, his longtime EMT partner, to help him. On December 13th, 2008, the 2 men traveled to Catherine's home in Narrowsburg, New York, strangled her, placed a heavy piece of debris on her chest to prevent her from breathing, and set the house on fire. The fire was meant to make Catherine's death look like an accident. The autopsy revealed the truth. Catherine Novak had not died of smoke inhalation. She had been killed before the fire started. The case went cold for 4 years. In 2012, Paul's ex-girlfriend called police and confessed that Paul had admitted the murder to her. She revealed the name of Paul's accomplice, Scott Sherwood, the EMT partner who had helped him kill Catherine for no reason other than loyalty. Paul Novak was born in approximately 1967. By December 2008, he was 41 years old and had worked as an EMT at Jamaica Hospital in Queens, New York, since 1991. He had spent 19 years in emergency medicine, responding to calls and saving lives, alongside his partner, Scott Sherwood. By 2008, Paul's marriage to Catherine Novak had deteriorated. The couple had 2 children together, but the relationship had become hostile. Catherine and Paul separated, and Catherine filed for divorce. The divorce proceedings were bitter. Paul faced a costly settlement. He faced a custody battle over the children. He saw Catherine as an obstacle to his financial stability and to his control over his own life. By December 2008, Paul had decided that Catherine needed to die. Catherine Novak was 41 years old. She was a former local school board member in Narrowsburg, New York, a small community in the Catskills. She was well-liked. She was the mother of 2 children, and she was fighting for custody of them in the divorce. Catherine was living in Narrowsburg while the divorce proceedings moved forward. She was trying to build a new life for herself and her children, separate from Paul. She did not know that Paul had recruited his ambulance partner to help him kill her. On December 13th, 2008, Paul Novak and Scott Sherwood traveled from Queens to Narrowsburg, New York. The 2 men had worked together as EMTs for years. They had responded to emergencies side by side, trusting each other with their lives. On this night, they were traveling to commit murder. The details of Scott Sherwood's exact actions during the murder are not fully documented, but what is known is that Paul and Scott strangled Catherine Novak. After she was dead, or perhaps while she was still alive but unable to resist, they placed a heavy piece of debris on her chest. The weight prevented her from breathing. Then they set the house on fire. The fire was meant to destroy evidence and to create a cover story. They wanted investigators to believe that Catherine had died of smoke inhalation in an accidental house fire. The fire department responded to the blaze and found Catherine dead inside. The initial assumption was that she had been overcome by smoke. The autopsy revealed otherwise. There was no soot in Catherine's airways. She had not been breathing when the fire started. She had been dead before the flames touched her. The fire had been staged to cover a murder. The investigation into Catherine Novak's death began in December 2008. Investigators knew that the fire had been set deliberately and that Catherine had been killed before the fire started, but they lacked evidence pointing to a specific suspect. The case went cold. 4 years passed. Then, in 2012, Paul Novak's ex-girlfriend, Michelle LaFrance, called police. She told investigators that Paul had admitted to murdering Catherine. She revealed the name of Paul's accomplice, Scott Sherwood, Paul's longtime EMT partner. In September 2012, Paul Novak was arrested in Florida. He had moved to Florida after Catherine's death and was working as a volunteer firefighter, an ironic twist given that he had used fire to cover up a murder. Paul was charged with first-degree murder, arson, and insurance fraud. Scott Sherwood was arrested separately and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The trial took place in 2013 in Sullivan County, New York. Prosecutors presented the motive. Paul had faced a costly divorce and a custody battle, and he stood to gain financially from Catherine's death. They presented the testimony of Scott Sherwood, who had turned state's evidence and agreed to testify against Paul in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sherwood described the plan, the trip to Narrowsburg, and the murder. Prosecutors presented the testimony of Michelle LaFrance, Paul's ex-girlfriend, who testified that Paul had confessed the murder to her. They presented the forensic evidence showing that Catherine had been killed before the fire started. The defense offered no compelling alternative. In 2013, Paul Novak was found guilty of first-degree murder, arson, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Scott Sherwood, the EMT partner who had helped Paul commit the murder, received a dramatically different sentence. Sherwood had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder the day before Paul's trial began. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony, Sherwood was sentenced to 3 to 12 years in prison. He was released on parole after serving his sentence. The case exposed the dark side of first responder brotherhood. Paul and Scott had worked together for years, building a bond of trust and loyalty. Paul exploited that bond to recruit Scott as an accomplice to murder. Scott, in turn, abandoned that same bond when he faced a life sentence, testifying against Paul to save himself. Paul Novak is 59 years old. He is incarcerated in the New York State Department of Corrections, where he has served approximately 12 years of his life sentence. He has no possibility of parole. He will die in prison. Catherine Novak was 41 years old, a school board member and mother trying to navigate a difficult divorce. Her husband, an EMT trained to save lives, recruited his own ambulance partner to kill her. The fire they set to cover the murder could not hide the forensic truth. Catherine was dead before the flames started. 2 children lost their mother to murder and their father to a life sentence behind bars. An ex-girlfriend's conscience broke a 4-year cold case. The EMT, who had spent 19 years saving lives, ended his career as a convicted murderer, serving life without parole. Case 6. Scott Sherwood. An EMT at Jamaica Hospital in New York helped murder a woman purely out of loyalty to his ambulance partner. Scott Sherwood was 36 years old in December 2008 when he traveled from Queens to Narrowsburg, New York, with Paul Novak to kill Paul's wife, Catherine. Scott had no financial motive. He had no personal grudge against Catherine. He had never met her. He helped Paul kill her because Paul asked him to, and because the bond between EMT partners can be intense, built on years of shared trauma and trust. Scott Sherwood drove upstate with Paul Novak, waited while Paul murdered Catherine, and assisted in setting the house on fire to cover up the crime. 4 years later, when Michelle LaFrance called police and identified Scott as Paul's accomplice, Scott was arrested and faced a lengthy prison sentence. He turned state's evidence. He testified against Paul Novak at trial, describing the murder and the cover-up in detail. In exchange for his cooperation, Scott Sherwood was sentenced to 3 to 12 years in prison. He served his sentence and was released on parole. He is a free man. Paul Novak is serving life without parole. The quote 10 that drove Scott to help commit murder could not survive the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. Scott Sherwood was born in approximately 1972. By December 2008, he was 36 years old and working as an EMT at Jamaica Hospital in Queens, New York. He was Paul Novak's longtime ambulance partner. The two men had worked together for years, responding to emergencies, saving lives, and building the kind of bond that only first responders understand. They had seen death together. They had saved lives together. They trusted each other. Scott had a long history of mental illness, including depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. His defense attorneys would later argue that his mental health issues made him susceptible to manipulation by Paul Novak. The argument did not excuse his participation in murder, but it provided context for how a man with no personal motive could be drawn into such a crime. Catherine Novak was 41 years old, the same victim whose murder was orchestrated by Paul Novak. Catherine was a former school board member and the mother of Paul's 2 children. She was living in Narrowsburg, New York, while the divorce proceedings moved forward. Scott Sherwood had no personal connection to Catherine. She was simply his partner's wife. He had no reason to want her dead. He killed her because Paul asked him to. On December 13, 2008, Scott Sherwood drove upstate from Queens to Narrowsburg with Paul Novak. The two men had worked together as EMTs for years. On this night, they were traveling to commit murder. The exact details of Scott's actions during the murder are not fully documented in the research available, but what is known is that Scott was present, that he assisted Paul, and that he helped set the house on fire after Catherine was dead. Scott's role was that of accomplice. He was the driver, the assistant, the partner who stood by while Paul killed his wife. After the murder, Scott helped Paul stage the fire to make Catherine's death look like an accident. Then the two men drove back to Queens. The case went cold for 4 years. In 2012, Paul Novak's ex-girlfriend, Michelle LaFrance, called police and revealed that Paul had confessed the murder to her. She told investigators that Paul's accomplice was Scott Sherwood, Paul's EMT partner. In September 2012, Scott Sherwood was arrested. He was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. He faced a lengthy prison sentence as an accomplice to first-degree murder. Prosecutors offered Scott a deal: testify against Paul Novak in exchange for a reduced sentence. Scott accepted. The day before Paul Novak's trial began in 2013, Scott Sherwood pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder. He agreed to testify against Paul. At Paul's trial, Scott took the stand and described his role in the murder. He described the trip to Narrowsburg. He described the plan. He described the murder and the fire. His testimony was crucial to Paul's conviction. Scott had been Paul's partner, his trusted ally, the man who had agreed to help him commit murder. Now he was the prosecution's star witness. In 2013, following his guilty plea and his testimony, Scott Sherwood was sentenced to 3 to 12 years in prison. The sentence was dramatically reduced due to his cooperation. Paul Novak, the man who had recruited Scott and orchestrated the murder, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Scott served his sentence. He was released on parole. He is a free man. The case demonstrated the dark side of first responder brotherhood. Scott Sherwood helped murder Catherine Novak for no reason other than loyalty to his ambulance partner. When faced with a life sentence, that loyalty evaporated. Scott testified against Paul and walked free years later. Scott Sherwood is 54 years old. He was released on parole and is no longer incarcerated. Catherine Novak is dead. Paul Novak is serving life in prison without parole. Scott Sherwood is free. He helped murder a woman he did not know because his ambulance partner asked him to. He testified against that same partner when the alternative was spending the rest of his life in prison. The quote underscore one underscore that drove him to murder could not survive the prospect of dying behind bars. Loyalty, it turned out, had limits. Case 7. Cody Alexander. In June 2008, a 22-year-old EMT shot his pregnant wife in the back of the head just hours before reporting for his 12-hour shift on an ambulance. Cody Alexander had recently finished paramedic school and was working with Acadian Ambulance in Louisiana. He was an active church member and a former missionary. On June 29, 2008, in Livingston Parish, Louisiana, Cody shot his wife, Krista Ann Alexander, in the back of the head with a 9mm handgun while she was getting clothes from her closet. Krista was 24 years old and pregnant with their first child. The couple had been married for only 3 months. After killing his wife, Cody left for his 12-hour shift on the ambulance. He worked the entire shift, responding to emergencies and saving lives, while his pregnant wife lay dead in their home. When his shift ended, he returned home and called 911 at 5:51 a.m., pretending to have just discovered Krista's body. The police arrived and examined the scene. The rigor mortis and liver mortis patterns told a different story. Krista had been dead for hours. Confronted with the medical evidence, Cody broke down and confessed the same afternoon. Cody Alexander was born in approximately 1986. By June 2008, he was 22 years old and working as an EMT with Acadian Ambulance in Louisiana. He had just finished paramedic school and was advancing his career in emergency medicine. He was an active church member and had served as a missionary, traveling to serve communities in need. To those who knew him, Cody was a young man of faith with a promising future in emergency medicine. In March 2008, Cody married Krista Ann Alexander. The marriage was new, only 3 months old when Cody killed her. Krista was pregnant with their first child. By June, she was preparing to become a mother. Cody was not preparing to become a father. The motive for the murder is not specified in the available research, but the outcome was clear. Cody decided that Krista and the baby had to die. Krista Ann Alexander was 24 years old. She was a newlywed, having married Cody in March 2008. She was pregnant with their first child. She and Cody were active in the church community together. Krista was building a life with a young husband who seemed devoted to faith and service. She was preparing for the birth of her first baby. She was getting clothes from her closet on the morning of June 29, 2008, when Cody shot her in the back of the head. She died instantly. The baby inside her died with her. June 29, 2008, Livingston Parish, Louisiana. The morning hours before Cody's shift. Krista Alexander was in the bedroom, getting clothes from her closet. Cowdy approached her from behind. He raised a 9mm handgun and shot her once in the back of the head. The shot was execution style, delivered to an unsuspecting victim in a vulnerable position. Krista died instantly. Cowdy left her body where it fell. He left the house and reported for his 12-hour shift with a Acadian ambulance. He worked the entire shift. He responded to emergencies. He saved lives. His pregnant wife lay dead at home. When his shift ended at approximately 5:30 a.m. the following morning, Cowdy returned home. At 5:51 a.m., he called 911. He told the dispatcher that he had just arrived home and found his wife dead. He played the role of the shocked and grieving husband. He was calm, controlled, and medically articulate. He had, after all, just finished paramedic training. The police arrived at 5:51 a.m. in response to Cowdy's call. They found Krista's body in the bedroom. Cowdy told them that he had just arrived home from his shift and discovered her dead. Investigators examined the body. They observed the rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles that occurs in the hours after death. They observed the livor mortis, the pooling of blood in the lowest parts of the body that creates discoloration. Both rigor mortis and livor mortis follow predictable timelines. The medical evidence was unambiguous. Krista had been dead for hours, not minutes. She had been dead since before Cowdy left for his shift. The timeline Cowdy had provided was impossible. Police confronted Cowdy with the discrepancy. They told him that the medical evidence proved Krista had been dead for hours. Cowdy broke down. That same afternoon, he confessed. He admitted that he had shot Krista before leaving for his shift. He provided a full confession. Cowdy Alexander was arrested on June 29, 2008. The same day he called 911 and the same day he confessed. He was charged with second-degree murder. The confession provided prosecutors with a clear path to conviction. The medical evidence corroborated the confession. Cowdy had killed his wife, worked a 12-hour shift, and then staged a discovery scene. The case proceeded to conviction. Specific trial details are not available in the research, but Cowdy's confession likely led to a guilty plea or a swift conviction. He was found guilty of second-degree murder. Cowdy Alexander was sentenced to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Louisiana, a conviction for second-degree murder carries an automatic sentence of life without parole. There was no judicial discretion. The sentence was mandatory. Cowdy Alexander, a 22-year-old former missionary and EMT, became an inmate in Louisiana's prison system. He was sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly known as Angola, one of the most notorious prisons in the United States. Cowdy Alexander is 40 years old. He is incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, where he has served approximately 16 years of his life sentence. He has no possibility of parole. He will die in prison. Krista Ann Alexander was 24 years old and pregnant with her first child. She had been married for 3 months. She was getting clothes from her closet when her husband shot her in the back of the head. He left for his ambulance shift, spent 12 hours saving lives, then came home and called 911. The medical evidence proved he had been lying from the moment he made the call. 2 lives were lost because a 22-year-old EMT and former missionary chose murder over marriage. The rigor mortis and livor mortis that Cowdy had learned about in paramedic school became the evidence that exposed his lie within hours of his arrest. Case 8. Joshua Ade. In August 2020, a 40-year-old paramedic opened fire on his ex-girlfriend's family during a radiator repair dispute, killing her father. Joshua Ade was a paramedic in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He and Rebecca Brocker had been in a relationship, but by August 2020, the relationship had ended. Joshua and Rebecca co-owned a vehicle from when they had been together, and that vehicle had become a point of contention. On a day in August 2020, Rebecca, her father, James Brocker, and a friend were working on the radiator of the vehicle in Winnebago County, Wisconsin. Joshua Aid arrived at the scene and opened fire on all three people. He shot James Brocker, killing him. He shot Rebecca Brocker, wounding her. He shot Rebecca's friend, wounding him. James Brocker was 59 years old. He had been helping his daughter fix a car. Joshua Aid, a paramedic whose career was built on saving lives, used a gun to inflict senseless carnage. At sentencing in 2021, the judge noted the irony. A man trained to heal had murdered over a radiator repair dispute. Joshua Aid was born in approximately 1980. By August 2020, he was 40 years old and working as a paramedic in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He had been in a relationship with Rebecca Brocker, but the relationship had ended by the summer of 2020. The breakup had been hostile. Joshua and Rebecca co-owned a vehicle, a remnant from when they had been together. By August 2020, the vehicle had become a source of conflict. Joshua could not let go of the relationship, and he could not let go of the property they had shared. James Brocker was 59 years old. He was the father of Rebecca Brocker, Joshua's ex-girlfriend. On a day in August 2020, James was helping his daughter fix the radiator on the vehicle she co-owned with Joshua. James was doing what fathers do, helping his daughter with car trouble. It was an ordinary task on an ordinary day. Rebecca Brocker was present, working on the radiator alongside her father. A friend was also present, helping with the repair. The three of them were focused on the radiator, the tools, the mechanics of fixing a vehicle. They had no reason to expect violence. August 2020, Winnebago County, Wisconsin. Rebecca Brocker, her father James Brocker, and her friend were working on the radiator of the vehicle Rebecca co-owned with Joshua Aid. The vehicle was parked. The radiator was the problem. The three of them were working to fix it. Joshua Aid arrived at the scene. The research does not specify whether he approached openly or ambushed from a concealed position, but the outcome was unambiguous. Joshua opened fire. He shot James Brocker. The shot was fatal. James died at the scene. Joshua shot Rebecca Brocker. She was wounded but survived. Joshua shot Rebecca's friend. He was wounded but survived. 3 people were shot during a radiator repair. 1 died. The violence was indiscriminate. Joshua was angry about the vehicle, angry about the breakup, and he used a gun to express that anger. A paramedic whose career had been built on responding to emergencies and saving lives had created an emergency and taken a life. The investigation was straightforward. The shooting occurred in August 2020. The victims immediately identified Joshua Aid as the shooter. Rebecca Brocker, wounded and traumatized, told investigators that her ex-boyfriend had shot her, her father, and her friend. The friend, also wounded, provided the same identification. There was no mystery about who had committed the crime. Joshua Aid was arrested shortly after the shooting. He was charged with first-degree intentional homicide for the death of James Brocker and 2 counts of attempted homicide for the shootings of Rebecca Brocker and her friend. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, clear motive, a relationship that had ended badly, and a dispute over a co-owned vehicle. The trial took place in 2021 in Wisconsin. Prosecutors presented the testimony of Rebecca Brocker, who had to take the stand and testify against the ex-boyfriend who had killed her father and shot her. They presented the testimony of the friend, who had also been shot. They presented evidence of the ended relationship and the co-owned vehicle. They presented ballistic evidence linking Joshua to the shooting. The defense offered no compelling alternative explanation. The jury found Joshua Aid guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of attempted homicide. In 2021, Joshua Aid was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, the judge addressed the irony that had defined the case. The judge noted that Joshua Ade was a paramedic, a man whose career had been built on saving lives. The judge emphasized the senselessness of the crime. A dispute over a vehicle had led to murder. A radiator repair had become a murder scene. A man trained to respond to emergencies with calm and professionalism had opened fire on 3 people, killing 1 and wounding 2. The judge's remarks captured the professional betrayal that made the case particularly shocking. Joshua Ade is 46 years old. He is incarcerated in the Wisconsin state prison system, where he has served approximately 4 years of his life sentence. He has no possibility of parole. He will die in prison. James Brocker was 59 years old. He was helping his daughter fix a radiator. A paramedic whose career was built on saving lives opened fire on all 3 people present. James died. His daughter and her friend survived their wounds. The judge captured the irony in sentencing. A man trained to heal had inflicted senseless carnage. A radiator repair became a murder scene because Joshua Ade could not let go of a relationship and a co-owned car. Case 9. Jerry Nichols. A paramedic in Illinois brutally stomped his wife to death and then tried to use his medical knowledge to explain away her injuries. Jerry Nichols was a former paramedic who, in the late 1990s, attacked his wife Jane in their Illinois home. He stomped on her head and chest with such force that the injuries were catastrophic. Jane died from severe blunt force trauma. After killing her, Jerry called first responders and claimed that Jane had fallen down the stairs and struck her head. He used medical jargon to describe her injuries, speaking to the paramedics in the language of emergency medicine to establish credibility and to make his story sound plausible. The autopsy revealed that Jane's injuries were far too severe for a stair fall. The force required to cause such trauma was massive and sustained. A forensic expert examined the injuries and discovered something remarkable: a distinct pattern bruise on Jane's skin. The pattern was the tread of a boot. The expert compared the pattern to Jerry's boots. The match was perfect. Jerry Nichols had stomped on his wife, and the tread of his boot had been imprinted on her body. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. Jerry Nichols was a former paramedic working in Illinois at the time of the crime. His age at the time of the murder is not specified in the available research, and the exact year of the crime is listed only as the late 1990s. Jerry had been trained in emergency medicine. He knew how to assess injuries. He knew what injuries from falls looked like. He knew the medical terminology that first responders used to communicate with each other. When he killed his wife, he tried to use that knowledge to mislead investigators. He spoke to the first responders who arrived at the scene in the language of emergency medicine, describing Jane's injuries in technical terms that suggested a stair fall. He positioned himself as the concerned husband trying to help, the paramedic who understood trauma and who was simply reporting what he had found. Jane Nichols was Jerry's wife. Her age at the time of her death is not specified in the available research, and details about her life are limited. What is known is that she was living with Jerry in Illinois. She was vulnerable to domestic violence from a husband who had the physical strength to kill her and the medical knowledge to try to cover it up. On a day in the late 1990s, Jerry attacked Jane in their home. He stomped on her head. He stomped on her chest. The violence was sustained and overwhelming. Jane died from the injuries. Late 1990s, Illinois. Jerry Nichols attacked his wife Jane in their home. The method of the attack was brutal. Jerry used his boots as weapons. He stomped on Jane's head with extreme force. He stomped on her chest with extreme force. The blunt force trauma was catastrophic. Jane's injuries were severe enough to cause death. After killing her, Jerry called first responders. He told them that Jane had fallen down the stairs. and struck her head. He described the injuries in medical terms, using the jargon of emergency medicine to make the story sound credible. He spoke to the paramedics as one professional to another, explaining what he had found and what he believed had happened. The first responders initially accepted his explanation. Jerry's use of medical language and his calm, professional demeanor confused them. Jane's body was taken for autopsy. The medical examiner found injuries that were far too severe for a stair fall. The force required to cause the trauma Jane had sustained was massive and sustained. This was not the result of a single fall down a flight of stairs. This was the result of repeated, violent blows. The medical examiner called in a forensic expert to examine the injuries more closely. The forensic expert made a discovery that would become the smoking gun in the case. On Jane's skin, the expert found a distinct pattern bruise. The pattern was clear and unmistakable. It was the tread of a boot. The expert photographed the pattern and compared it to Jerry's boots. The tread pattern on Jane's body matched the tread pattern on Jerry's boots exactly. The match was perfect. Jerry had stomped on Jane, and the physical evidence of that stomping was imprinted on her skin. The forensic evidence was irrefutable. Jerry Nichols was arrested following the forensic analysis. He was charged with first-degree murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The autopsy showed that Jane's injuries were incompatible with a stair fall. The forensic pattern evidence proved that Jerry had stomped on her. The boot tread match was visual, compelling, and undeniable. The trial took place in Illinois in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Prosecutors presented the medical examiner's testimony, explaining that the injuries were too severe for a stair fall. They presented the forensic expert's testimony, showing the jury photographs of the boot tread pattern on Jane's body and comparing it to Jerry's boots. The evidence was presented visually. The jurors could see the pattern on Jane's skin. They could see the tread on Jerry's boots. They could see that the two matched. The prosecution also presented evidence of Jerry's attempts to use medical jargon to confuse the first responders. Jerry's paramedic training, which he had hoped would help him cover up the crime, became evidence of his guilt. He had known what a stair fall should look like, and he had tried to pass off stomping injuries as a fall. The jury found Jerry Nichols guilty of first-degree murder. Jerry Nichols was sentenced to 60 years in prison. At the time of sentencing in the late 1990s, a 60-year sentence was effectively a life sentence. Jerry would likely die in prison. The case was featured on Forensic Files in an episode titled Sign of the Zodiac. The episode demonstrated the power of forensic pattern evidence. The boot tread imprinted on Jane's skin had become the irrefutable proof that Jerry had killed her. Jerry's medical knowledge had not been able to overcome the physical evidence. Jerry Nichols is incarcerated in the Illinois prison system. He has served approximately 25 or more years of his 60-year sentence. His current age is not available in the research. Jane Nichols was stomped to death by her husband. A paramedic who knew exactly what injuries from falls looked like tried to pass off stomping injuries as a stair accident. His medical jargon could not fool the forensic expert who found his boot tread imprinted on his wife's body. The pattern was a perfect match. The case became a Forensic Files episode, teaching a generation of investigators the power of pattern evidence. Jerry Nichols is serving 60 years, effectively the rest of his life, for stomping his wife to death. Case 10. Richard Angelo. The quote underscore 13 underscore was a volunteer EMT and registered nurse who injected patients with paralytic drugs so he could rush in and quote underscore 14 underscore them to look like a hero. Richard Angelo was 25 years old in 1987 when he worked as a nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital on Long Island, New York. He was a volunteer EMT who had progressed to a career as a registered nurse. He was diagnosed with a hero complex and deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. He wanted to be seen as an exceptional nurse, the kind of professional who could handle any emergency. He craved praise and recognition from his peers. He suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological condition in which a person induces medical emergencies in others in order to quote underscore 15, quote underscore them, and receive validation. Richard Angelo injected pavulon and anectine, paralytic agents that cause respiratory arrest, into the IV lines of patients under his care. He intended to induce a code blue, then resuscitate the patient and be praised as a hero. He miscalculated. Instead of heroic saves, he created deaths. He is suspected of killing at least 10 patients. He was convicted of 4 murders. A survivor who reported him to authorities broke the case. Angelo was sentenced to 61 years to life. He died in prison in 2001 at the age of 39. Richard Angelo was born in approximately 1962. By 1987, he was 25 years old and working as a registered nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital on Long Island, New York. Before becoming a nurse, he had served as a volunteer EMT, responding to emergencies in his community. His progression from volunteer EMT to registered nurse reflected his commitment to emergency medicine. But beneath the professional credentials was a psychological need that would drive him to kill. Angelo was diagnosed with a hero complex. He had deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. He wanted desperately to be seen as exceptional, as the nurse who could handle any crisis, as the professional who saved lives when others failed. He craved recognition and praise from his colleagues. The need for validation was so intense that it warped his judgment and his sense of right and wrong. Angelo suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which a person induces illness or injury in another person in order to gain attention or praise for caring for or underscore quote underscore 16 underscore that person. The victims Richard Angelo targeted were multiple adult patients at Good Samaritan Hospital. They were patients in the ICU and telemetry units, already critically ill or vulnerable. They were dependent on the hospital staff for survival. They trusted the nurses who cared for them. They trusted that the medications administered through their IV lines were meant to heal them, not harm them. At least 10 patients are suspected to have been killed by Richard Angelo. 4 deaths were proven through conviction. The names of the individual victims are not specified in the available research. What is known is that these were sick people who came to the hospital for healing. People who were already fighting for their lives. People who could not defend themselves against injections delivered into their IV lines by a nurse they had no reason to distrust. In 1987, at Good Samaritan Hospital on Long Island, New York, Richard Angelo worked as a registered nurse in the ICU and telemetry units. He had access to patients who were critically ill. He had access to their IV lines. He had access to the medication storage areas. Angelo would inject pavulon and anectine into the IV lines of patients under his care. Pavulon and anectine are paralytic agents. They paralyze the muscles, including the muscles used for breathing. When these drugs are administered, the patient experiences respiratory arrest. The patient stops breathing. If the patient is not immediately resuscitated, the patient dies. Angelo's plan was to inject the drugs, induce a code blue, and then rush to resuscitate the patient. He wanted to be the hero who saved the patient's life. He wanted his colleagues to see him successfully handle a crisis. He wanted praise. He wanted recognition. The plan required precise dosing and perfect timing. Angelo miscalculated repeatedly. Instead of creating emergencies he could resolve, he created deaths. Hospital staff began to notice a pattern. Code blues, cardiac and respiratory arrests that required immediate intervention were spiking during Angelo's shifts. The increase was statistically impossible to explain as coincidence. The breakthrough came when a patient survived one of Angelo's injections. The patient called for help and reported Angelo. The survivor's urine was tested for toxins. The tests confirmed the presence of pavulon and nicotine, paralytic drugs that the patient should not have received. Investigators reviewed other suspicious deaths that had occurred during Angelo's shifts. They exhumed bodies. They ran toxicology tests. The pattern was undeniable. Pavulon and nicotine were found in patients who had no medical reason to receive them. At least 10 deaths were suspected to be Richard Angelo's work. In 1987, Richard Angelo was arrested. He was charged with multiple counts of murder and manslaughter. The trial took place in 1989 in New York. Prosecutors presented the testimony of the survivor, the patient who had reported Angelo and whose urine tests had confirmed the presence of paralytic drugs. They presented toxicology evidence showing that pavulon and nicotine had been found in victims who should not have received those drugs. They presented pattern evidence showing that code blues had spiked dramatically during Angelo's shifts. They presented psychological expert testimony explaining Angelo's hero complex and his diagnosis of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They presented evidence that Angelo had accessed drugs he was not authorized to use. The defense offered no compelling explanation for the presence of paralytic drugs in patients who had not been prescribed them. The jury found Richard Angelo guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree manslaughter, and 1 count of criminally negligent homicide. He was convicted of 4 deaths, though he was suspected of at least 10. In 1989, Richard Angelo was sentenced to 61 years to life in prison. At the age of 25, the sentence was effectively a life sentence. Angelo became known as the Angel of Death. The case highlighted the danger of hero complexes in medical settings and became a cautionary tale about Munchausen syndrome by proxy in healthcare. Hospitals across the country increased scrutiny of unexplained code blues and began implementing protocols to track patterns of patient deterioration by shift and by caregiver. The case forced the medical community to confront the reality that not all caregivers enter the profession with pure motives. In 2001, Richard Angelo died in prison. He was 39 years old. He had served approximately 12 years of his 61-year sentence. The cause of death is not publicly specified. Richard Angelo never reached parole eligibility. He never achieved the heroism he had desperately sought. Richard Angelo is deceased. He died in prison in 2001 at the age of 39. He was a volunteer EMT and registered nurse who wanted desperately to be seen as a hero. He injected at least 10 patients with paralytic drugs, intending to save them and earn praise. He miscalculated every time. He killed instead of saved. A survivor's testimony broke the case, and toxicology confirmed the presence of drugs that had no medical justification. Angelo was sentenced to 61 years to life. He died in prison at age 39, having spent 12 years incarcerated. The __quote _1 8 _ never got the hero's recognition he craved. At least 10 victims came to the hospital for healing and were killed by a nurse whose need for validation had become serial murder.